The gravel road hadn't been maintained in at least a decade, maybe longer. Maya Cordell felt every rut and pothole through the worn suspension of her 15-year-old Honda as she climbed higher into the Cascade foothills, the October afternoon light filtering through Douglas fir and western hemlock in scattered golden coins. The GPS on her phone had given up 2 miles back, the little blue dot freezing in place before the screen blinked to no service. She didn't need it anyway. Her hands remembered the turns, even if her conscious mind had tried to forget them for nearly 20 years. The cabin appeared around the final bend exactly as it had lived in her memory, yet somehow smaller, more wounded by time. The cedar shake roof sagged in the middle like an old horse's back, and blackberry vines had claimed the western wall with the aggressive enthusiasm that only Pacific Northwest brambles could muster. The front porch listed slightly to the left, and the windows, those windows where she'd pressed her nose as a child, watching for her grandfather's truck, were dark with grime and the papery remains of wasp nests. Maya killed the engine and sat for a long moment in the settling silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant conversation of crows in the timber above. She hadn't wanted to come back. Not to this mountain, not to this cabin, not to the tangle of memories that grew thick as the blackberries around every weathered board and rusted nail. But the letter from the county had been clear. The property taxes were 3 years delinquent, and if she didn't settle the account or sign over the land within 60 days, they'd auction it off to pay the debt. Her mother, reached by phone in the Arizona retirement community where she'd fled after Grandpa Jack died, had been characteristically blunt. "Do whatever you want with it, Maya. I'm never setting foot in Washington again. That place took enough from me." Maya understood that sentiment more than she cared to admit. She'd built her whole life in Portland over the past 15 years, a decent job managing a bookstore in the Pearl District, a circle of friends, a studio apartment with a view of a parking lot but cheap rent, a routine that was comfortable even if it wasn't exactly fulfilling. She'd convinced herself she was content, or at least content enough. Then 3 months ago, the bookstore owner had sold to a corporate chain, and Maya's position had been restructured into non-existence. 2 weeks after that, her boyfriend of 4 years had casually mentioned over Thai takeout that he'd been seeing someone else and thought they should transition their relationship. Maya had spent the following weeks on her futon, cycling through streaming services and existential questions until the county letter arrived and gave her directionless drift something resembling a purpose. The cabin key was exactly where Grandpa Jack had always kept it, tucked under the third river rock from the left of the porch steps, wrapped in a Ziploc bag that had somehow survived 2 decades of mountain weather. The lock resisted, corroded and stubborn, but finally gave with a grinding click that echoed too loud in the surrounding stillness. The door swung inward with a horror movie creak, and the smell hit her immediately. Not decay exactly, but the deep, musty scent of a place where air had grown thick and old, seasoned with dry rot, dust, and the faint ghost of wood smoke from fires burned long ago. Inside, the cabin was a museum of abandonment. Furniture sat where it had been left, now draped in dust covers that Maya couldn't remember anyone placing. Her grandfather's reading chair still angled toward the river rock fireplace. The kitchen table, scarred by years of use, still wore a faded tablecloth with a pattern of roosters. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with the kinds of things that accumulate in a place visited season after season. Decks of cards, kerosene lamps, bird identification guides, jigsaw puzzles in battered boxes, mason jars full of unidentifiable hardware. On the mantel, photographs in frames gone cloudy with age. Grandpa Jack holding up a steelhead, his grin huge and proud. Maya's grandmother, who died before Maya was born, standing in front of this very cabin when it was new and bright. Maya herself at maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding a stick like a sword. She'd spent every summer here as a child, shipped up from California, where her parents were slowly destroying their marriage with professional efficiency. This cabin had been sanctuary, a place where the rules were simpler and the days stretched long and golden. Grandpa Jack had taught her to fish, to identify animal tracks, to build a fire, to be comfortable in silence. He'd been a man of few words but deep kindness. A retired logger who'd worked these mountains when logging still meant something other than controversy. before the spotted owl and the court injunctions and the slow economic strangling of every mill town in the Cascades. Maya walked through the cabin, touching things gently, as if they might dissolve under her fingers. The hand pump at the kitchen sink, which drew water from the spring up the hill, squeaked when she tried it, but produced only a throaty gurgle. The cupboards held canned goods expired by a decade, their labels faded to pastels. In the bedroom, the iron frame bed still wore its quilts, and she recognized the pattern, log cabin, how appropriate, that her grandmother had stitched by hand. Every object was a small memory, a fishhook in her heart. The sun was lowering toward the ridge when Maya noticed the floorboard. She'd been standing in the main room, trying to decide if this trip was going to be a quick assessment and retreat, or if she'd actually stay the night, when her weight hit a spot that gave slightly and produced a hollow thunk different from the solid sound of the boards around it. She stepped back and looked down. The wide plank fir floors had been a point of pride. Grandpa Jack had milled them himself from timber on the property, but this one board, near the fireplace, sat slightly higher than its neighbors. Maya knelt down, running her fingers along the edges. The board was maybe 3 feet long, and when she pressed on one end, the other lifted slightly. No nails. She worked her fingers under the gap and pulled, and the board came up easily, deliberate, revealing a space beneath hollowed out between the floor joists. The cavity was perhaps 8 inches deep, and inside, wrapped in what looked like an old wool blanket, was a metal box. Her heart was suddenly loud in her ears. The box was military green, powder-coated steel about the size of a briefcase, with a simple latch closure. Maya lifted it out carefully, surprised by its weight. She carried it to the table, pulled out one of the ladder-back chairs, and sat down before opening it, some instinct telling her this was a moment that deserved ceremony, deserved presence. Inside the box, the past had been carefully preserved. On top lay a stack of letters, easily 100 of them, tied with string gone brittle with age. Beneath those, photographs, not the casual snapshots on the mantel, but formal portraits, candid moments, images that had clearly meant something worth hiding. There was a velvet jewelry box, a military medal in a presentation case, a small leather journal, and at the very bottom, a bundle of cash, old bills, 20s and 50s and 100s, bound with a rubber band that crumbled to dust when Maya touched it. She picked up the medal first. Purple Heart, issued to Jack Henry Cordell. She knew her grandfather had served in Vietnam, but he'd never spoken of it, not once in all the summers she'd spent here. When she'd asked as a teenager, he'd simply shaken his head and said, "That's done and gone, sweetheart. No point dragging old ghosts into good daylight." The citation in the case was spare. Wounds received in action, 1969, Quang Tri Province. She set it aside gently and reached for the photographs. The first few showed a young man who was recognizably her grandfather, but transformed by youth, lean and dark-haired, wearing fatigues, squinting into tropical sun. Then there were photos of him with other soldiers, arms slung over shoulders, the complicated expressions of young men in war. And then the photos changed. A Vietnamese woman appeared, delicate and beautiful, with a smile that reached her eyes. In one image, she wore a white áo đai and stood in front of a building with French colonial architecture. In another, she was laughing, caught mid-motion, her long black hair swinging. Then there were photos of the two of them together, Jack and this woman whose name Maya didn't know, and the tenderness in those images was unmistakable. They weren't just friends, they were in love. Maya's hands trembled as she set down the photographs and reached for the letters. The string fell away and she opened the first envelope. Postmarked from Saigon, 1970. The handwriting was careful, the English slightly formal. "My dearest Jack, I think of you every day and pray you are safe in your home across the ocean. The city is more dangerous now. My father wants me to leave, but I have nowhere to go. I keep your promise close to my heart and wait for the day you said would come. With all my love, Lynn." Maya read letter after letter as the light through the grimy windows shifted from gold to orange to purple. The story emerged in fragments, pieces of a narrative her grandfather had never shared. Jack and Lynn had met in 1968 when he was stationed near Saigon. She'd worked as a translator for the American forces. They'd fallen in love, conducted some impossible romance in the chaos of war. He'd promised to bring her to America, to marry her, to build a life together. He'd filed the paperwork, navigated the bureaucracy, sent her money. The letters grew more desperate as 1974 became 1975, as the North Vietnamese advanced and Saigon descended into panic. Lin wrote of evacuation plans, of bribes paid to get on lists, of hope and terror in equal measure. The final letter was dated April 27, 1975, 3 days before the fall of Saigon. "My love, I go to the embassy tomorrow. They say the helicopters are coming for those with American papers. I have everything you sent me. Soon I will see your face again, and not just in my dreams. Wait for me. I'm coming home to you. Forever yours, Lin." But there were no more letters after that. Maya sat in the deepening darkness, understanding settling over her like cold water. Lin hadn't made it out. Somewhere in the chaos of the American withdrawal, in the panicked final days of the war, she'd been lost. Maya thought of her grandfather, who'd returned to these mountains, who'd eventually married her grandmother, a marriage that by all accounts had been affectionate but never passionate, who'd built this cabin and worked himself to exhaustion in the timber, and never, ever spoken about the woman he'd loved first and maybe most. The money in the box made sense now. It was probably what he'd saved to bring Lin over, to set up their life together. He'd hidden it here along with the letters and photos, not spending it, not throwing it away, just preserving it like a shrine to a future that never arrived. Maya opened the leather journal. The entries were sporadic, scattered across years. Most were brief, almost cryptic. Still no word. Embassy says records lost. Hired another search service. Dead end. 20 years today since Saigon fell. Wonder if she thinks of me. The last entry was dated 3 years before his death. I'm too old now and too tired. If I couldn't find her in all these years, I never will. Some promises can't be kept, no matter how hard you try. God forgive me. Maya wept then, sitting alone in the dark cabin, crying for her grandfather's hidden grief. For a woman named Lin who died or disappeared half a world away. For the weight of secrets carried for decades. For all the ways love could be lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. She cried too for herself, for her own smaller losses and failures. For the way she drifted through her life without the kind of conviction or passion that would drive someone to keep searching for 40 years. She must have fallen asleep at the table, her head on her arms, because she woke to darkness complete and a crick in her neck. The cabin was cold, the kind of penetrating damp cold that comes up through the floorboards in mountain October. Maya fumbled for her phone, used its light to find one of the kerosene lamps, and was surprised when it still had fuel and lit on the second match. The warm light pushed back the darkness into the corners, making the cabin feel almost alive again. She couldn't stay here, not tonight, not without heat or water, or any of the utilities her soft city life had made essential. But she couldn't leave yet either. There was something unfinished here, some task that had been waiting for her without her knowing it. She gathered the letters carefully, placing them back in the metal box along with the photographs and the medal and the journal. The money she counted, $3,200 in bills so old they felt like cloth. She put it all back together, closed the box, and carried it to her car. The drive down the mountain in the dark was nerve-wracking, her headlights barely strong enough to pick out the rutted road. But she made it to the highway, and then to the small town of Cascade Springs, the nearest settlement, which was barely more than a crossroads with a gas station, a diner and a motel that had seen better decades. She rented a room that smelled of pine sol and regret, carried the metal box inside, like it was full of explosives, and spent the night lying awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, thinking. By morning she'd made a decision, or rather, the decision had made itself in that way important things sometimes do, arriving fully formed without conscious deliberation. She couldn't undo her grandfather's loss, couldn't bring Lin to the future she'd been promised, couldn't heal a wound 40 years closed, but she could honor it. She could try to finish the story, even if finishing it only meant knowing the ending. The Cascade Springs Public Library was housed in a converted church, its pointed windows now looking out over a parking lot instead of a cemetery. The librarian was a woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a manner that suggested she didn't get many visitors with research questions. Her name tag read Dolores. "I'm trying to find information about someone who might have died in Vietnam," Maya explained. "A Vietnamese citizen. During the fall of Saigon. Dolores's expression shifted from polite interest to something more engaged. "That's quite a search," she said. "Records from that period are complicated, but there are resources, databases. Are you family?" Maya hesitated. "She was important to my family." Over the next 3 hours, Dolores proved to be a research wizard. She showed Maya how to access State Department archives, refugee records, Red Cross databases, and memorial sites maintained by Vietnamese expatriate communities. They searched under Lin with various surname spellings, looking for women the right age who'd applied for evacuation or been processed through refugee camps or appeared on casualty lists. There were dozens of matches, none conclusive. The problem, Dolores explained, is that thousands of people disappeared in those final days. Some died in the chaos. Some were detained by the North Vietnamese when they took over. Some escaped by boat later and ended up in camps all over Southeast Asia without a full name, date of birth, or some other identifying information. It's like looking for a specific grain of sand. Maya felt the search slipping away from her before it had really begun. Then Dolores asked, "Do you have a photograph?" Sometimes the expatriate communities maintain photo archives. People trying to find lost family members. Maya showed her the clearest photo of Lin, the one in the white ao dai. Dolores studied it, then did something with her scanner and her computer, and uploaded the image to a site called Vietnam Lost and Found. She filled out a form explaining that they were searching for a woman named Lin, last known to be in Saigon in April 1975, connected to an American serviceman. "It's a long shot," Dolores admitted, "but this site has helped people make connections before. The community monitors it. If anyone recognizes her, they'll reach out." Maya thanked her profusely, left a donation for the library, and walked out into the thin October sunshine, feeling both foolish and strangely hopeful. She was chasing a ghost, trying to solve a mystery that had defeated her grandfather for 4 decades. What made her think she could succeed where he'd failed? She spent the next 2 days cleaning the cabin, working with a kind of manic energy that kept the difficult emotions at bay. She hauled out trash bags full of expired food and rodent-damaged fabric. She scrubbed floors and windows, shocked when the glass revealed views she'd forgotten. The meadow sloping down to the creek, the wall of timber rising up the mountain behind. She got the hand pump working again, priming it with bottled water until it coughed and sputtered, and finally drew clear, cold spring water. She swept out the fireplace and chimney, carefully, terrified of bringing down 100 pounds of creosote and bird nests, and when it was clear, she built a fire, and the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of burning alder. On the 3rd evening, as she sat in Grandpa Jack's chair watching the fire, her phone buzzed. She'd driven down to the highway that morning to charge it and check for reception, and 1 bar of service had followed her partway back up the mountain. The email was from Vietnam Lost and Found, subject line, "Your search query, possible match." Her hands shook as she opened it. The message was from someone named Thomas Nguyen, writing from Sacramento. "I saw your post about Lin. I think the woman in the photo might be my aunt, my mother's sister. Her name was Truong Thi Lin. We lost contact with her in 1975 and were told she died when Saigon fell, trying to get to the American embassy. My mother is still alive and has been looking for information about her sister for 50 years. Please contact me." Maya read the message 3 times, her heart hammering. She replied immediately, fingers clumsy on the small keyboard, providing her phone number and asking him to call. Then she drove back down to the highway and waited in the gathering dark. Parked at the wide spot where the logging road met pavement, her phone on the dashboard, volume turned all the way up. The call came 20 minutes later. Thomas Nguyen's voice was warm, tinged with a California accent and an undercurrent of excitement. He'd shown the photo to his mother, 83-year-old Mrs. Truong, and she'd wept and confirmed it was her younger sister, Lin, who she'd last seen in April of 1975. Mrs. Truong had evacuated with her husband and children on one of the last helicopters, had assumed Lin would follow on a later flight, but she'd never arrived. For decades, the family had believed her dead. "My mother had no idea about the American soldier," Thomas said quietly. "Lin never told us. It was complicated then. Dangerous to be involved with Americans, even working for them. She must have kept it secret." Maya explained about her grandfather, about the letters, about the promises made and broken by circumstances. She could hear Thomas relaying information to someone in the background. Voices speaking rapid Vietnamese, and then an older woman's voice, trembling and insistent. "My mother wants to know about Jack," Thomas translated. "She wants to know if Lynn's letters talked about being happy." Maya thought of the careful handwriting, the words of love and hope. "Yes," she said. "The letters say she was very happy, that she loved him very much." The conversation that followed lasted an hour, Maya and Thomas piecing together the parallel stories. Jack had searched through official channels, but the chaos of the evacuation and the subsequent closing of relations with Vietnam had made it nearly impossible. Mrs. Truong had searched too, filing missing person reports, checking with refugee organizations, hoping her sister had somehow escaped by boat. Neither had known the other existed. Neither had known that someone else was searching too. "What happened to Jack?" Thomas asked gently. "He died 7 years ago," Maya said. "He never stopped looking for her. He never forgot her." There was a long pause. Then Thomas said, "My mother says that Lynn would have been grateful to be loved like that, even if they couldn't be together. She says it's a blessing to finally know what happened, to know Lynn wasn't alone at the end, that she had love and hope. She wants to know if she can meet you, if she can see the letters." They arranged to meet the following weekend in Portland, neutral ground halfway between the cabin and Sacramento. Maya drove back to the city, her apartment feeling strange and small after days in the mountain silence, and spent the intervening days reading and rereading the letters, preparing herself for the encounter. Mrs. Truong arrived with her son and daughter-in-law, a small woman with white hair and eyes that held depths of memory. She embraced Maya like family, this stranger who carried pieces of her sister's lost life, and together they sat in Maya's tiny living room and went through the box's contents. Mrs. Truong held each photograph like it was made of light, tears streaming down her face, speaking in Vietnamese, her son translating. "This one was taken at our cousin's wedding. Lynn was so beautiful that day. Here she's standing in front of the school where she studied French. I remember when this was taken. It was right after she got the job with the Americans. She was so proud, so hopeful about the future." When they reached the letters, Mrs. Truong read them in the original English, her lips moving silently, occasionally pressing a page to her heart. When she finished, she looked at Maya with an expression of profound sadness and profound peace. "My sister died trying to reach love," she said in carefully pronounced English. "Not running away in fear, trying to reach love. That is good death, honorable death." She insisted that Maya keep the letters and photos. They were meant for Jack, and now they are for Jack's family. But she asked if she could have copies made. Maya spent the afternoon at a print shop while the Nguyen family waited, duplicating every letter and photograph. When she returned, Mrs. Truong had prepared a small ceremony. She'd brought incense and flowers and a photograph of her own, a family portrait from before the war showing 2 young girls in traditional dress, the sisters. They set up a makeshift altar on Maya's coffee table, placed the photos side by side, Lynn and Jack, Lynn and her family, Jack in his uniform, Jack at the cabin. Mrs. Truong lit the incense and spoke in Vietnamese, a prayer or a blessing or a goodbye, and Maya felt something in the room shift, some long-held tension finally releasing. Before they left, Thomas handed Maya an envelope. "My mother wanted you to have this. Please don't open it until we're gone." After their car pulled away, Maya opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note in shaky handwriting. "For the cabin. Keep it in the family. Keep memories alive. Thank you for giving me back my sister. Thank you for letting her rest." Maya stood in her apartment, check in hand, and felt the trajectory of her life bending, the path forward suddenly clear in a way it hadn't been in months or maybe years. She wasn't going to sell the cabin. She was going to restore it, to make it whole again, to turn it into something that honored the love that had been lost and the connections that had been found. She didn't know exactly what that meant yet. Maybe a retreat space, maybe a place for veterans or refugees, maybe just a sanctuary she could share with others who needed mountain silence and time to heal. The specifics would come. What mattered was the commitment, the decision to build instead of abandon, to remember instead of forget. Over the following months, Maya worked on the cabin every weekend and many weekdays, her unemployment benefits stretching further without city rent to pay. She hired local contractors for the structural work, new roof, new foundation supports. Plumbing and electrical upgraded to code, but did much of the finish work herself, learning skills from YouTube videos and the helpful advice of neighbors she gradually met. The mountain community, sparse as it was, turned out to be full of people with time and knowledge to share. A retired carpenter named Bill showed her how to properly refinish the fir floors, carefully working around the board that had hidden the metal box. A woman named Sarah, who ran a plant nursery down the valley, helped her clear the blackberries and put in a garden that would come back perennial. Native plants that would feed the pollinators and the wildlife. She created a small memorial inside the cabin, a shelf near the fireplace that held the photograph of Jack and Lynn alongside the Purple Heart, and a vase she kept filled with whatever was blooming, wildflowers in spring and summer, evergreen boughs in winter. She framed one of the letters, the one where Lynn wrote, "Love is the only thing stronger than fear, and ours is strong enough to cross oceans." Maya started a blog about the restoration, about the story of Jack and Lynn, about the process of uncovering hidden histories and honoring lost love. It found an audience she hadn't expected: veterans, refugees, adoptees, anyone who'd experienced displacement or loss or the long reverberations of war. People wrote to her sharing their own stories, their own searches for missing pieces. Some asked if they could visit the cabin, and Maya found herself saying yes, opening the space for small retreats, workshops on grief and healing, quiet weekends for people who needed to think or cry, or sit in silence by a fire. Mrs. Truong visited twice, once in spring when the meadow was full of lupine and Indian paintbrush, once in fall when the vine maples turned the hillsides flame orange and gold. She brought more family, grandchildren, cousins, a whole diaspora of Truongs who'd scattered across America after the war. They held a ceremony at the cabin, Buddhist and Catholic and secular all mixed together, formally honoring Lynn's memory and celebrating her love story. They planted a Japanese maple in the meadow, a tree that would turn red each fall, a living memorial. Thomas became a friend, a brother by story if not by blood. He helped Maya navigate the process of getting Lynn's name added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorials in Memory Wall, which honors Vietnamese allies who died supporting American forces. It was a small thing, just a name on a database, but it meant Lynn was remembered officially, publicly, her existence and sacrifice acknowledged. On the 7-year anniversary of Grandpa Jack's death, Maya held a small gathering at the cabin. Mrs. Truong came, and Thomas, and some of the veterans from the online communities Maya had connected with, and the mountain neighbors who'd become friends. They shared food and stories, and Maya read some of the letters aloud, and people cried and laughed and raised glasses to love that transcends circumstances, to promises kept even when they can't be fulfilled, to the way the past reaches forward and shapes us in ways we don't expect. That night, after everyone had gone and the cabin was quiet again, Maya sat in her grandfather's chair and wrote in her own journal, a practice she'd taken up during the restoration. She wrote about how she'd come here lost and directionless, how she'd found more than she'd been looking for, how the discovery under the floorboards had changed everything, not because of what it was, but because of what it demanded: attention, honor, action, connection. She'd been drifting through a half-engaged life, and this place, this story, had woken something in her, given her purpose and community, and a sense of being part of something larger than her own small concerns. She thought about her grandfather, carrying his grief silently for all those years, never speaking of it but never forgetting, and she understood now that this was its own kind of strength. He'd built a life even with loss at its center. He'd been kind and present and generous, even while holding an ocean of private sorrow. The cabin had been his memorial, his monastery, the place where he kept his truest self alive. Maya had inherited that place and that story, and in accepting the inheritance, she'd found her own truest self, not the person who drifted through retail jobs and mediocre relationships, but someone capable of depth and commitment, and the kind of love that does the work even when the beloved is lost or gone. She was building something here, something that would outlast her, something that said, these lives mattered, this love mattered, and we remember. The fire burned low and the night deepened, and outside the windows the mountain stood silent under cold stars, holding all its stories, the ones carved into its timber, the ones washed down its creeks, the ones whispered by wind through hemlock and fir, the ones hidden under floorboards, waiting for someone to lift them into light. Maya pulled the quilt closer and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely at home, completely awake, completely alive to the beautiful, terrible gift of being human, in a world where nothing lasts and everything matters, and love somehow finds a way to survive even the unsurvivable. She thought of Lynn in the last days of Saigon, making her way toward the embassy with papers in hand and hope in her heart, believing in promises, believing in love. She thought of Jack getting the news, or worse, never getting news, just silence stretching on and choosing to live anyway, to work and build and love his granddaughter, and keep the faith that somewhere, somehow his love was received and returned. She thought of Mrs. Truong, carrying the loss of her sister for 50 years, and still finding the grace to offer gratitude and blessing when the story finally surfaced. These were her teachers now, these people she'd never met or barely known. They taught her that you can survive anything, that love doesn't require completion to be real, that the work of honoring what matters is never wasted, even if it takes decades or generations. They taught her that coming home isn't always about returning to where you started. Sometimes it's about finding the place where your deepest self can finally breathe and root and grow. Maya fell asleep in the chair, and when she woke in the deep middle of the night, the fire had gone to embers, and the cabin was cold, but she was warm under the quilt her grandmother had stitched. In the chair her grandfather had worn smooth, surrounded by the story that had chosen her as much as she'd chosen it. Outside an owl called, and somewhere far off a coyote answered, and the mountain breathed its ancient breath, and everything was exactly as it needed to be. In the morning, she'd wake and build up the fire and make coffee, and work on the grant proposal for turning the cabin into an official retreat center. She'd call Thomas and discuss the scholarship fund they were establishing in Lynn's name for refugee students. She'd walk the property line and plan where to clear trail and where to let the forest reclaim its own. She'd live into the future that had opened before her, built on a foundation of the past, finally known and honored. But for now, in the deep quiet of the mountain night, she simply rested in the peace of having found her place and her purpose, of having discovered what was hidden and brought it into light, of having said yes to the call she didn't know she was waiting for. The cabin held her gently, this structure her grandfather had built with his own hands, and she understood now that he'd built it not just as a retreat from the world, but as a keeper of memory, a vessel for love, a promise in wood and stone that some things endure beyond the span of a single life. She returned to the forgotten cabin, and what she found under the floor changed everything, not with drama or sudden revelation, but with the slow, certain transformation that comes when we finally pay attention to what the past is trying to tell us, when we honor the loves and losses that shaped us, when we choose connection over isolation and meaning over comfort. Changed everything, and in changing everything, made everything new. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden histories in your own family, or the power of love to reach across time and loss, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a story from your own past that changed how you see the present, or tell us about a place that holds memory for you. Subscribe and follow for more stories that dig deep into what it means to be human, to lose and find and carry on. These stories matter because you're here listening. Because together we're keeping memory alive and honoring the truth that even in our loneliness, we're connected by the universal experiences of love and loss and the search for meaning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And if you're carrying a story that feels too heavy to hold alone, know that sharing it, even with strangers, even in a comment section, can be the first step toward healing. We're listening. Your story matters too.